On an evening in her small kitchen, a nurse in her early 40s set a manila envelope of transfer papers on the table. Knowing one signature meant leaving the clinic and that road. Most nights, her black house cat slept on the couch. Tonight he slid down, sat by the door where her keys waited, and laid one paw on the envelope, golden eyes flicking toward the bright white line outside, as if asking whether this choice was truly the way forward. The late morning sun lay over the two-lane blacktop like warm glass as Claire guided her compact car toward town. Fields ran out on either side, pale with leftover winter stubble, fence posts leaning at easy angles. She rolled the window halfway down, letting in air that smelled of thawing earth and diesel. It should have felt simple. Yet as the familiar low hill rose ahead, a small knot tightened under her breastbone. At the little rise before the county line, her foot eased off the gas without her consent. Nothing marked the spot now but a faint patch where the asphalt had been resurfaced years ago. Still, the steering wheel felt heavier in her hands, and her breathing shortened as if the road itself were watching. She told herself it was only habit, the residue of old calls, nothing more. Grown women did not flinch at pavement. The clinic sat tucked behind the town's grocery store, a one-story brick building with a narrow strip of parking and a view of the water tower. Inside, fluorescent lights and cheerful posters tried to soften the smell of antiseptic. Monitors beeped, printers chattered, voices rose and fell. Claire moved through it all on well-practiced wheels, checking vital signs, changing bandages, listening to stories about weather and grandchildren, trying not to hear the wind push at the glass. On her lunch break, she sat in the cramped staff room with a sandwich and the local paper. Somewhere beyond the wall, a low thump sounded, followed by a scrape along concrete, light but distinct, as if something jumped down from a ledge and tested its footing. The vending machine hummed. Someone laughed in exam 3. She paused, half-chewed bite resting on her tongue, then shook herself. Old buildings made noises. That was all. Back at her small rental house on the edge of town, the porch steps sagged in familiar ways. She dropped her blue scrubs on a chair and moved through the kitchen, flicking on the kettle. When she reached for a mug, her fingers brushed against something fine on the counter. A single, short black hair, not her colour, too straight and sleek to be from any sweater. She wiped it into her palm, studying it with a faint, inexplicable shiver. Later, taking the trash out, she stepped onto the porch and stopped. Across the worn welcome mat, a pattern of small ovals tracked from one side to the other, pressed into thin dust. Each print was no bigger than the pad of her thumb, arranged in pairs that curved neatly near the top step, then turned back. No damp shoes had come through that door today. A cool prickle climbed the back of her neck despite the mild air. That night, rain began in soft taps on the roof, the kind of sound that usually lulled her to sleep. Lying in the dark, she felt the mattress shift almost imperceptibly, as if weight had settled somewhere down near her feet. The old frame creaked once. She held her breath, listening. Beyond the window, distant tires hissed on wet pavement, then faded. Her skin cooled, heartbeat loud in her ears, until she finally exhaled. Houses settled. Minds played tricks. Before dawn, a gust rattled the loose porch rail and jolted her awake. She sat up too fast, chest tight, pulse racing as if she'd been called to an emergency. The room was grey and still, yet the feeling lingered, a sense that something just beyond her walls kept to a schedule she hadn't set. Wandering between her little house and that low rise on the highway, tracing paths she could almost hear but not yet name. Morning came clear and sharp, washing the night's unease in pale sunlight. Steam rose from the wet road like breath. Claire locked her front door, pausing as a faint scuff sounded from under the porch light. Quick. A small weight adjusting on wood. She bent to check the lattice, found only shadows and a blown leaf caught in cobwebs. Raccoons, she muttered, forcing a smile she didn't quite feel, and headed for the car. On the drive out, the radio buzzed with cheerful chatter she barely heard. As the low hill approached, she turned the volume down and let the hum of the tires fill the car. Her hands tightened on the wheel. The bright, wide white centre line ahead had been freshly painted last month. It glared against the darker asphalt. She reminded herself to breathe slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she coached anxious patience. From the crest, the road unfurled ahead in 2 clean lanes. At first she saw only the glare on the paint and the dark strip of tar. Then her eyes caught on a small, dark knot standing exactly on the bright white centre line, halfway down the slope. It did not lie like debris. It stood, upright and still. Her heart skipped. She eased off the gas, signalling as she guided the compact toward the shoulder. As she drew closer, the knot resolved into a small animal, its body sleek and neat, tail wrapped around its paws. 2 yellow eyes regarded her, unhurried. It made no move to flee, simply held its spot on the bright wide white centre line as if the stripe had been drawn there for it. When she finally rolled to a stop on the gravel, hazard lights ticking, the animal rose with measured grace and stepped just off the paint. She lowered the window halfway. Warm spring air carried the smell of wet earth, tar, and something faintly musky. The small black house cat stood in full view now, not more than a few yards away, paws on dark asphalt, body parallel to the bright white centre line. One ear flicked toward her engine, then toward the open fields. It gave a single brief blink, like an acknowledgement, then turned and walked calmly toward the far shoulder. At the clinic later that morning, between patients, she heard two men at the front desk talking. "You seen that black cat on County A?" One asked. "Sits right smack on the centre line, like he's directing traffic." The other chuckled. "Nearly put Ellen in the ditch yesterday. She says it stares her down, then steps off at the last second. Blames it for her blood pressure." Their laughter brushed against Claire's nerves like sandpaper. On her way home, she took the same road, telling herself it was the fastest. As she crested the hill, there he was again. The little black cat, waiting near the bright white centre line, only this time sitting just to the right of the paint, as if testing a boundary. He did not bolt as she passed, only tracked her with his gaze. The air inside the car felt warmer. One question lodged stubbornly in her mind. Why that exact stretch? That evening, as she carried in groceries, a dark shadow flowed off the hood of her compact and slipped under the hedge before she could fully register it. The hood bore 4 new dusty ovals near the windshield, as precise as the ones she'd seen on the mat. On her kitchen counter, beside the fruit bowl, a single short black hair lay against the pale laminate. Her chest tightened and then, oddly, loosened. Something had clearly chosen a route between her driveway and that hill. She stood at the sink after sunset, washing dishes as the town quieted. Out beyond her window, headlights traced soft arcs on distant streets. In her mind, she could picture the hill under the same sky, the bright, wide, white centre line glowing faintly in the dark, and a small black shape sitting or walking somewhere along it. The presence was no longer just a noise or a print. It had eyes, habits, and a seat on a line she still dreaded. Before there was a porch to sleep on or a nurse to watch, the black cat had other roots. He had known the shudder of a carrier on a passenger seat, the sway of a car over that same hill in heavy rain, the shock of sound when everything changed at once. He remembered light slashing through dark, cold water flung against mesh, voices raised in a language he did not speak. He remembered a hand on his paw, warm and steady in the middle of it. After that night, he had known a small bungalow in town that smelled of furniture polish and an older woman's perfume. Bowls appeared at regular hours. Laps were available most evenings, and a crocheted throw on the couch held the sun well. Still, when trucks rumbled past outside or rain drummed hard on the roof. Some restless part of him rose to the window. There was always the sense that something unfinished waited beyond the glass. One spring, a visiting nephew left the screen door unlatched. A gust pushed it open just enough. The cat slipped through the gap as naturally as water follows a path. The porch boards were rough under his paws, the grass wet and deep. Down by the roadside ditch, the air smelled of oil, earth, and the faint metallic tang of the hill he remembered. Engines hummed in the distance like distant thunder. He followed the sound. He learned ditches first, how the grass muffled his presence, how culverts made useful tunnels, how to flatten himself when headlights swung wide. Long winters taught him harder lessons. Snow narrowed his world. Food grew scarce. He traded the soft couch for the underside of parked trucks, the warmth of an idling engine for the scratchy shelter of hay bales. More than once, heavy steps thudded too close and boots kicked at shadows. He stayed quick and small, vanishing when needed. There were barns that smelled of cattle and diesel, porches with bowls set out in charity, back steps where someone spoke softly as they filled a dish and pretended not to look directly at him. He took what he needed and moved on, never quite putting his weight all the way down anywhere. Trust, once broken in the middle of rain and lights, did not knit back easily. The road, though, pulled stronger than any one doorstep. By wandering and watching, he mapped the whole stretch near the hill. He knew which mailboxes rattled when hit by wind, which gravel drives spat stones onto the shoulder, which dogs lunged at their fences and which only barked for form. He memorized the way big trucks sighed as they downshifted and the way small cars drifted when drivers were distracted. The bright, wide white center line, when it was repainted, gleamed like a fresh scar. On clear days he crossed the hill in the weeds, invisible to anyone but himself. On days when clouds pressed low or rain blurred edges, he stepped closer, sometimes onto the very paint. He learned that if he sat there, perfectly still, humans would slow. Some cursed, some laughed, some did not see him until the last second. Each reaction etched itself into his understanding. A small body in the wrong place could change the way metal moved. He had brushes with danger that left their own shadows. Once, a truck clipped the edge of the shoulder where he crouched, wind like a slap. Another time, a child's hand reached for him too fast. He darted, narrowly avoiding a bicycle wheel. Through it all, he returned to the hill. The memory of the night when lights had lit the rain and a hand had steadied his paw hung over that place like a smell. Leaving it altogether felt like betraying something he could not name. By the time he discovered Clary's porch warm hood, quiet yard. Familiar smell of clinic and road writ together on her clothes. He was neither fully wild nor fully tame. He understood doors, but not the urge to stay behind them. He understood kindness, but not the wisdom of trusting it. Most of all, he understood that some lines on the ground mattered more than others. The bright, wide white stripe on the hill was one of those. After a string of long shifts, Claire finally admitted to herself that she had begun timing her errands around the hill. She took the river road when she could, added 5 extra minutes to reach a patient's trailer, chose side streets that looped away. Yet some days there was no practical way to avoid it. On those days, she felt her stomach tighten miles in advance, even as she told herself she was being foolish. One afternoon, she stood in her kitchen with a container of roasted chicken from the diner. Habit made her reach for a plate. Something else made her reach for a smaller plastic tub. She tore a few pieces into bite-sized strips, snapped the lid on, and set it near her keys. The motion carried its own quiet decision, like answering a phone that had already been ringing too long. She didn't try to talk herself out of it. The hill rose under full daylight, fields bright on either side. From the crest, she saw the bright, wide white centerline stretch ahead, empty for a breath. Then, as if stepping out of nowhere, the small black cat trotted from the right-hand ditch and hopped lightly onto the paint. He sat at the slope's midpoint, tail wrapped around his paws, as if head clocked in for an afternoon shift. Her pulse jumped. She signaled and eased onto the shoulder. Hazard lights ticking. She cracked her door and stepped out, the air smelling of sun on tar and distant manure. Kneeling beside the open driver's door, blue scrubs creasing at the knees, she opened the tub. The cat watched her, yellow eyes level, not begging, not fleeing. She set a piece of chicken just off the bright white centerline, on the darker asphalt, then drew her hand back and waited. He didn't pounce. Instead, he lifted his head, ears turning toward the bend in the road. A low, rising hum reached her, a car coming fast. Her shoulders tightened. She stayed in her crouch. Only when the sedan swept past, driver's eyes widening briefly at the sight of her hazard lights, did the cat step forward. One paw landed squarely on the paint, the other just off it. As he lowered his head to eat, it looked almost like he was bracing the line. Without fully planning to, Claire extended her fingers, palm up. "You picked a dangerous desk," she murmured. The cat paused mid-bite, then leaned in and pressed his head gently into her hand. The contact was brief, no more than a heartbeat, but it carried the weight of a small agreement. Her throat tightened. For a fleeting second, she saw another night, another patch of asphalt, another moment when a small paw had reached for her in the rain. A horn blared sharply behind her. She startled, standing too fast. A pickup idled a few car lengths back, driver hanging out the window. "You can't just stop in the road for some cat," he shouted. "You'll get someone killed." Heat flushed up her neck. "I'm on the shoulder." She called back, but her voice was thin against the engine. He shook his head, muttered something she couldn't catch, and roared around, giving the cat a wide berth without seeming to notice had done it. The next day at the diner, over coffee, Claire heard her own behaviour replayed without names. "Saw that clinic gal out on the hill," a farmer at the counter told the waitress. "Parked there, feeding that black thing like it's her supervisor. She's going to end up in my rear bumper one of these days." The waitress snorted. "Well, that thing's slowed down 3 city folks who come through here like it's the interstate," she said. "Maybe he's cheaper than another sign." Back on her porch that evening, Claire nearly tripped over a dark shape waiting on the top step. The black cat sat there, tail tucked neatly, as if he'd been expecting her. When she opened the door, he padded 2 steps inside onto the worn rug, then stopped. He sniffed the air, glanced toward the hallway, and, after a moment, turned and settled right back on the rug by the threshold. It was as if Head chosen the doorway as his own line to hold. Spring pushed hard a week later. The sky lowered into a heavy grey lid by mid-afternoon, and wind pressed flat the new grass along the ditches. In the clinic, the waiting room filled with coughs and worries. Claire moved from room to room, adjusting oxygen, easing fears, checking pulses. Each time the automatic door hissed open, a gust brought in the smell of rain and something electric that made her shoulders crawl. Just before closing, the receptionist waved her over with wide eyes and the phone pressed her shoulder. "It's Mrs. Lang," she said. "Out near Maple Ridge. Short of breath. Chest pressure. Alone until her son can drive in from the plant. County medics stuck at a wreck on the South Highway. Dispatch wants to know if you can check on her. Keep her stable until transport frees up." The question hung between them heavily, though they both knew the answer. Outside, rain started in earnest, thick drops splatting on the asphalt and bouncing. Claire grabbed her emergency bag, shrugged into a thin rain jacket, and jogged to the compact. The GPS on her dash offered 2 routes. The longer, lower road by the river, or the shorter climb over the hill with the bright, wide white centre line. She stared for a beat too long, listening to the thunder roll somewhere beyond town. Then she took the shorter path, heart thudding. Visibility shrank as she drove. Wipers thrashed. Water streamed across the glass. The bright, wide white centre line appeared and disappeared like a ghost under moving curtains. Each hiss of the tyres over standing water pulled at a thread of memory. A night. Sirens. Lights. The feeling of doing everything right and still being too late. Her fingers cramped on the wheel. Breathe. Claire, she muttered, forcing her lungs to obey her own advice. At the crest of the hill, a new sound cut through the drumming rain. The deep, uneven roar of a heavy truck climbing from behind. In front of her, through blurred glass, a small dark shape materialized on the bright wide white centre line, as precisely placed as ever. The black cat stood there, fur plastered flat, eyes bright in her headlights. Instead of stepping aside at her approach, he held his ground, tail low, body taut. Her foot moved to the brake, easing the car toward the shoulder. Behind, the truck's engine grew louder, too loud, closing distance faster than it should in this weather. A horn blared once, long and angry. Panic flashed. She imagined metal sliding, skidding sideways, recreating every worst scene Shed tried not to see again. If she stayed half in the lane, the driver might slam his brakes and lose control. If she gunned it, she would drive blind into whatever lay ahead and over whoever stood there now. The cat broke the stalemate. He sprang forward along the bright, wide, white centre line, then veered toward a shallow curve where the ditch on one side foamed brown. Stopping at a slight slump in the shoulder, he stared down into the water and let out a harsh, tearing yowl that cut through rain and engine both. It was not the casual call of a hungry stray. It was an alarm. He looked back at her, then down again. Insistent. Claire jerked the wheel, pulling the compact completely onto the grassy edge until one tyre sank into mud. She flipped off her headlights, leaving only the frantic pulse of her hazard lights to mark her. The truck exploded over the crest moments later. Driver's face pale behind streaked glass as he registered her car and the small dark figure by the bright wide white centre line. He wrenched the wheel toward his own shoulder, trailer fishtailing dangerously before it straightened and roared past. A wall of spray slammed the compact, then fell away. Her first instinct was to slam the car into gear and flee, to put miles between herself and the memory trying to replay. But the black cat hadn't relaxed. He stood at the sagging edge of the shoulder, staring into the churning ditch, tail lashing. Another raw yowl tore free. Whatever lay below was not going to wait for another unit to free up. Claire felt the pull of two lives now. Mrs. Lang in her quiet living room, counting breaths, and whoever, or whatever, was fighting water a few feet from her boots. As she opened her door, the storm shoved it back against her leg. Cold rain soaked her neckline in seconds. She grabbed her bag and stomped toward the broken shoulder, heart thudding so hard it almost drowned out the thunder. The cat backed up half a step, making room for her at the edge, but did not leave. He held his post on the bright, wide white line of crumbling asphalt, as if drawing one more boundary she could either answer or walk away from. She dropped to her knees on the broken edge, mud soaking through her scrubs. Below, the ditch had turned into a brown, pounding channel. An overturned mobility scooter lay half submerged, lights still faintly blinking under the water, clinging to a clump of grass near it, fingers digging into the slick bank. An elderly man fought to keep his head above the rush. His jacket ballooned with water. His breath came in ragged gasps. Help, he wheezed, barely audible over the storm. 2 emergencies were now pinned to her ribs. The unseen one at Mrs. Lang's house, and this one thrashing in front of her. Neither could be postponed. Claire's mind wanted to split into 2 bodies, and failed. The black cat yowled again from his spot on the bright wide white centre line, tail thrashing, eyes locked on the man's face. Each time the man's grip slipped, the sound sharpened, as if refusing to let him slide under unnoticed. She slid down the muddy bank, boots skidding, catching herself on clumps of grass. Cold water grabbed at her calves, numbing them instantly. She hooked one arm under the man's, bracing her shoulder beneath his chest to keep him from folding. "I've got you," she shouted, more for herself than for him. "Stay with me." "What's your name?" His teeth chattered. "Harold," he managed. Thought it'd just pull over. "Let that truck by." He coughed, sending a spray of ditch water toward her shoulder. With her free hand, she fumbled in her bag, fingers numb, until she found the crinkling foil of an emergency blanket. She wrapped it clumsily around his shoulders, tucking it under his chin. It was a thin shield against the cold, but it was something. She jammed her phone between shoulder and ear, calling dispatch with location, situation, warnings about the undercut road. Her voice sounded calmer than she felt. Training lent her words, even as fear hammered at the edges. Sirens wailed faintly, somewhere far off, then grew louder. Time stretched into a series of counted breaths. "Tell me something about yourself," she ordered Harold, forcing his attention back from the grey edges of exhaustion. "What do you do on Tuesdays?" His watery laugh hitched. "Cards." "At the Legion," he rasped. "They're gonna be mad I'm late." Above them, the black cat crouched low, eyes unblinking, as if he too were waiting for the next card to turn. When the first fire truck pulled up, its lights strobing red against the rain, a firefighter swore softly at the sight of the collapsed shoulder. Another foot gone, and this whole piece would have taken your car with it, he said as they set up ropes. The crack that had split the bright wide white centre line was wider now, bits of asphalt dropping into the froth below. The trooper from before arrived. Hat plastered flat, eyes taking in the scene. His gaze lingered on the cat, then on Claire's mud-spattered scrubs. They hauled Harold up in slow, grunting stages, boots sliding, hands braced. On the road, paramedics wrapped him in dry blankets, checked his lungs, started warm fluids. His pulse, weak but steady, thrummed under Claire's fingers as she helped. You again, he puffed, squinting past her. And that little fellow. He nodded weakly toward the black cat, who now sat beside an emergency cone. Tail wrapped like head claimed his spot among the responders. Didn't think it'd have such a crowd. Only once Harold was loaded and the ambulance pulled away did the weight of her other promise slam back. Claire dashed to her car, hands shaking, and called the clinic. Another medic had reached Mrs. Lang via the river road. She was at the hospital already, on oxygen, stable. You did exactly what you needed to. The voice on the line said firmly when she stammered an apology. You were the only one who could see that ditch. The words unknotted something deep that had been tight for years. Rain eased to a drizzle as crews marked the damaged edge with cones and tape. The trooper stepped over to her, looking older in the grey light. I gave you a hard time about stopping for him, he said, tipping his head toward the cat. Today I'm glad you did. If you'd parked where most folks do, we'd be fishing you out with him. His mouth twitched. Guess we've got a new kind of crossing guard on this hill. She looked at the black cat, now dripping and unbothered, as he walked along the bright, wide white centre line to sit by her front bumper. When she opened the driver's door, he hopped lightly onto the hood and pressed his forehead to the wet glass near her hand. For the first time in a long while, the hill felt less like a place that had taken someone from her, and more like one that had just given someone back. Some part of her fear loosened its grip and let in a thin, clean breath. That night, news moved faster than official reports. At the diner, between the clatter of plates, people traded versions of the story. The washed-out shoulder, the nurse who climbed into the ditch, the small black guardian who had stood on the line until someone listened. No one could agree on whether he belonged to anyone. Maybe he belongs to the road, the waitress said at last. setting down coffee. The thought settled into Clara's chest with a surprising warmth. In the weeks that followed, the county patched the broken shoulder, poured fresh asphalt, and laid a new, bright, wide white centerline in one unbroken stroke. New yellow signs went up before the rise, politely telling drivers to slow. Still, the real change came from the story. People eased off the gas when they saw the hill now, eyes automatically scanning for a small black shape near the paint, as if he were part of the infrastructure. Life at the clinic slid into a rhythm that felt both familiar and lighter. Claire still checked blood pressures, adjusted medication schedules, listened to worries about sugar and knees. But now, when patients brought up the hill, their voices carried something besides fear. "Saw your partner out there this morning," one older man joked, "sitting on that line like he's charging toll." Another said, "You tell that cat he kept me from tailgating some fool yesterday." She smiled more often than she argued. At home, the black cat's presence deepened into routine. Most mornings he waited on the top porch step, tail curled neatly. As she locked her door, he would walk with her to the car, hop onto the hood, and sit just above where the bright, wide white centerline would pass under the engine later. She developed a habit of tapping the metal twice before starting the car and saying softly, "Shift change." He seemed to understand, hopping down as the engine rumbled to life. He began accompanying her, too, on foot rounds close to town. When she visited Mr. Keegan for follow-up after his ditch ordeal, the cat padded along the cracked sidewalk behind her. Keegan, wrapped in a cardigan, opened the door and barked a laugh. "There's my saviour," he said, looking past Claire to the black tail flicking politely on the porch. The cat accepted one gentle stroke, then took up a post by the threshold while nurse and patient talked inside. At the diner, someone finally tacked a photo to the community board. A slightly blurry shot of the cat perched at the hill's crest beside the bright, wide white centerline. Claire's compact visible in the distance. Underneath, in tidy handwriting, someone had added, "Hill Patrol, please slow down." The sheriff rolled his eyes when he saw it, but he didn't take it down. "Cheapest traffic calming we've ever had," he admitted to Claire in passing. On Sunday afternoons, when she had no shifts and the weather cooperated, Claire sometimes parked on the widened shoulder at the hill and simply sat on the low guardrail with a thermos. The black cat would jump up beside her, leaning his slight weight against her hip. They watched cars crest and descend, heard the low usual sounds of town in the distance. A train horn, a mower, church bells softened by air. The hill no longer felt like a scar so much as a lookout. Inside herself, the change surprised her most at night. Storms still came, rattling her windows, lighting the sky in harsh flashes. But when thunder rolled now, she found her mind going not only to past failures, but to that muddy ditch, that foil blanket, that thin chest rising under her hand because she was there. Somewhere between those memories ran the picture of a small black figure on a bright wide white centerline, insisting that she look again when danger was easy to miss. That insistence had become part of her own heartbeat. Summer slid in slowly, warming the fields into a soft hum of insects and cutting hay. On a sunlit afternoon between shifts, Claire drove the familiar road without a call pressing at her. The sky was high, the air clear. As she crested the hill, she saw him, the small black cat sitting just off the bright wide white centre line, not blocking, merely present, tail laid around his paws like punctuation. She smiled before she could help it. This time she pulled fully onto the safe gravel, cut the engine, and stepped out without hurry. A few cars passed, already moving slower, drivers lifting 2 fingers in easy greeting. Claire walked to where old asphalt met new and stood for a moment with one foot on either side of the faint seam. The cat ambled over, bumped his head against her shin, then sat facing the miles ahead with her, as if clocking in for a quieter shift. Back home that evening, sunlight slanted through her kitchen window onto the small table by the wall. Claire spread out a notebook she hadn't touched in years and began to write. Longhand, about a hill, a painted line, and a small life that had claimed both as its root. It wasn't for any report or chart. It was simply a record that the place that had once taken so much space in her fears now held something else. A shared watch. A strange peace. Later, she sat on the porch with a mug of tea, listening to the town settle. The black cat curled in the chair beside hers, paws tucked, eyes half closed. Streetlights blinked on one by one. Somewhere, tires whispered over the hill. She pictured them slowing just a little, scanning for a small dark shape. The thought no longer made her chest hurt. It made her feel included. The road had become part of her story, not just the other way around. As dusk deepened, she reached over and rested her fingertips lightly along the curve of his back. He rumbled a low purr, steady as a well-tuned engine. "We did all right," she murmured. Ahead, the miles would still bring storms and sirens and hard choices. But now, when she faced them, she would carry the memory of a bright, wide, white centre line, a sunlit country road, and a black cat who had once asked her to stop and in doing so, helped her start moving forward again. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.